All right, so the 1920s, sometimes referred to as the Roaring Twenties, sometimes referred to as the Jazz Age, not often referred to as the Roaring Twenties anymore by historians, because I think it's been generally acknowledged that it wasn't so roaring for everybody. It's obviously in the South a period of high Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement. And it's a period of time in which there continue to be quote-unquote race riots, which are essentially massacres of black people in their communities by white people. It's the period where women had only just begun to have the constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. It's a period of discrimination against immigrants and so on, and the paralyzed fear of the so-called Red Scare, terror coming. It's a bad time for labor unions. It's a bad time for a lot of farmers throughout the country. It's a period in which wages for working class people were stagnant, and so on and so on. That being said, it was a period of relative economic stability and growth. America was maturing as an industrialized nation and as a consumer culture. It is a period in which we can see what we call marginalized people pushing their way into the main stream of American society, if we will allow the mixed metaphor, marginalized and mainstream. So, there are elements of the decade that live up to that Roaring Twenties name, and we'll talk some about jazz, perhaps the quintessential American art form, which is an African American creation. But I want you to keep in mind that beginning in 1929, whatever aspects of it that were jazzy and roaring are going to begin to come crashing down. And we'll talk about that process, the onset of the Great Depression. First, though, you'll recall when last we spoke, during the end of the Great War and into the early 1920s, there's a revolution in Russia which sees the communists come to power in what becomes the Soviet Union. And the communists in the Soviet Union begin to implement their version of revolutionary socialism, which sees the elimination of notions of private property ownership when it comes to factories and farms especially. But then the way the Communist Party operates too is antithetical, the opposite of what an ideal democracy would be, in that it's one party rule, there's no opposition, no civil liberties are protected like freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And it becomes a dictatorship. So already, if you're a capitalist in America or Britain or France or wherever, you see a revolutionary socialist movement as threatening to you. And then tack onto that the fact that when these revolutionary socialists come to power, the form of government they bring to bear is a totalitarian dictatorship. And the opposite of a democracy, what happens there is doubly threatening to you. And people throughout the industrialized capitalist world begin to worry if it could happen in Russia, it could happen to us too. And that includes in America, and red is the color associated with the communists. And so this upswing of hysteria over the possibility of a communist revolution in America we know is the Red Scare. It is a period of time in which the U.S. Attorney General allows federal authorities to simply raid party meetings of the Communist Party USA or the Socialist Party in America, and to arrest hundreds of people without warrants and to detain them. And it's a period of time in which the American government detains and deports hundreds of immigrants because it was thought that it's these immigrants from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe that are going to bring these radical ideas into America. a place that they felt like was the bastion of classical liberalism and not somewhere where these kinds of ideas would take root unless they're brought to America by these immigrants. We have a regrettable tradition throughout American history of lashing out and imposing all of our issues or problems, or most importantly, fears, on immigrants. You could change who these immigrants are, where they come from over time, and then again, in this period it was Italians and Polish and Slavic peoples. Sometimes it's East Asians, sometimes it's Latinos, of course. But in this period, it was Southern and Eastern Europeans that are thought to be bringing in radical socialist ideas or communist ideas. Remember that the labor movement, organized workers have in America been associated already with radical leftist ideologies, usually wrongly. But to be fair, Eugene Debs, the great labor leader of America in this time, or at least one of them, was in fact a socialist. Now, he was a democratic socialist. Look at the pen, representing the IWW, running for president of the Socialist Party that is running in a democratic election, not advocating a violent revolution. He's not a communist. He's not a revolutionary socialist. But Americans also traditionally don't like nuance, and they just want to lump all of these people in the labor movement in the same pool as what the people that came to power in the Soviet Union. So it's a bad time for labor, in other words. It's a bad time for people like Debs. That being said, look at the flip side of that. It's a great time for big business, great time for corporations. The Republican Party is in power in the White House and in Congress for most of this decade. You have a succession of Republican presidents. And the Republican Party had, by that time, become the party of big business. And they've become the party for advocating, essentially, a return to laissez-faire. Remember our pendulum I said was going to swing back and forth? Where we had a laissez-faire, let them do hands-off approach to big business and the economy during the Gilded Age, but the progressives convinced you that some government regulations were needed. And then the Great War convinced you that even more government regulations were needed. Warren Harding runs for president in the beginning of this decade by saying we're going to have a, quote, return to normalcy. Meaning we had to do a bunch of crazy shit because we're engaged in the Great War. Now it's over and we won and we can get back to normalcy. What he means is a return to laissez-faire, a rolling back of regulations, of letting corporations do whatever they want, and of taking that more hands-off approach again. That approach is carried forth by his successors in the White House, Calvin Coolidge, who says something to the effect of the business of the American people is business, or something stupid like that, that was to intimate that, what's great for every American is allowing big business to do what they're going to do and to stay out of their way. And then the third and final Republican president of the decade is going to be Herbert Hoover. Hoover is going to be in the White House when the wheels start to come off of the American economy, beginning in 1929. So keep him in the back of your mind. Well, America is, by the 1920s, you might say, fully industrialized, and come out of the economic fits and starts of the Gilded Age to be a mature industrial society and a maturing consumer culture, entering into the age of mass production. Henry Ford, a lot could be said about Henry Ford, founder of Ford Motor Company. Among other things, he was a virulent racist and anti-Semite. He was also, though, a close student of efficiency. He was obsessed with the study of efficiency, especially in the production of the automobile. Before Ford, the automobile was a luxury item. It was very expensive, it was difficult and time-consuming to make, and only the most wealthy Americans could afford one. Ford sets his mind to making an affordable automobile that most Americans could afford to purchase. And he finds the answer to this in the assembly line. Of course, gone are the days of the water wheel and the steam engine. We now have the electric motor and the generation of electricity that could run heavy machinery as an assembly line in a gigantic factory outside of Detroit, Michigan, in the town of Dearborn, and eventually many more. But a giant open factory with a long, long assembly line in which at any given time, dozens or even hundreds of cars are in the process of being produced. Each worker had a station along that assembly line and performed one task on that automobile, and then the assembly line moves down and that car goes on to the next group of workers who perform some other task, and that first group then performed their same task on the next one. And if your single task is installing a headlamp or a windshield or putting on a tire or something or a wheel, you're going to get real good at it. I mean, it would be mindlessly monotonous, terrible work maybe. But you get real efficient at doing what you do, and eventually you could speed that assembly line up. And again, having dozens or hundreds of cars in production at any given time, as opposed to, say, the old Craftsman model of this group of workers starts and builds this car from the ground up, and then they can, that one ships off and they start on a new one. So the electric motor makes this possible, and Ford is eventually able to create the Model A and the Model T automobiles that, with financing or credit, could be available to the average middle-class American. And he makes a fortune off of it, and his company was actually unique for much of the 20s, and they do offer wages that would tend to increase throughout the decade, and among the highest wages in the country. People actually flock to Detroit and wherever else to work for Ford Motor Company. It's especially important not only because the automobile would become essential for what becomes American society in the 20th century, and we'll talk some more about that in the 50s lecture. It's also important because assembly line style mass production is subsequently applied to essentially everything else. All other consumer products. Processed foods like Campbell's soup. This radio, and perhaps even that lamp, and everything from cigarettes to bottled soda. You name it, all of it's going to be produced using some kind of assembly line style mass production. All of our consumer products these days are made this way, to the point where we have now fetishized things that are not assembly line produced, meaning we make a big special deal about it. What do we call it now when something's not mass produced like assembly line style?
Unique.
Yes, and handcrafted, right? So this becomes the model for consumer goods production, period. To the point where, and again alluding to the 50s lecture, when we come back to this, even homes are in a sense mass produced. Do you remember the basic definition I gave you of consumer culture? I don't know if I asked you this in the quiz or not. It's a society in which, go ahead.
It's you buy more
Yep.
than what you sell.
So it's a society in which you purchase the things you need to buy them, like you say, instead of producing them yourselves, right? So you go back to the 18th century, and in essence, most people have produced a lot of their own clothing, produce a lot of their own food, and so on. The daily necessities of life. In an industrial society, you are a consumer, and you consume or you purchase those things. But from the very beginning in a consumer culture, companies who produce consumer goods want to convince you that that word necessities or needs is much broader than just the clothes on your back and the food in your pantry. They want to convince you through advertising and marketing that you need all kinds of shit. I love this because look at this. It just says it outright. Everybody needs Campbell's soup, you know, probably targeting the housewife. You know, what kind of housewife, mother, homemaker are you if you don't have a bunch of Campbell's soup in your pantry? Or Heinz baked beans or various other canned food or otherwise processed food products. You also need a radio. You need this nice furniture. You need that lamp. That man needs that nice business suit to go work in his white-collar job in the city. You need, if you have electricity in your home, probably an electric sewing machine. Your kid needs a baseball bat and glove to play ball, and so on. All kinds of new consumer products. What we would call today, beauty products for the lady or her elder daughters, perhaps. Various grooming products for the man. Various chemical products for cleaning and so on that are being created by big chemical corporations like Dow or what's the other one? DuPont. And of course, among the vehicles for advertising or marketing could be print, but also by this time that radio, it becomes the centerpiece of the middle class or wealthy family home. In the days before television, it was the radio. And that radio carried the same kind of programming that you would expect on sort of what we call network television. In fact, the early radio networks are what become the early TV networks later. And they would carry, of course, news at night at various points in the day. They would have variety programs. They have the equivalent of what we would call like soap operas or dramas and that kind of thing. And, of course, they had what else? To tie this back into consumer culture. Yeah, commercials, advertising, right? And especially knowing that that woman is the one at home during the day, broadcasting to her the idea you need fill in the blank, fill in the blank, fill in the blank to make your life easier, better, more fulfilling, and so on. The radio becomes the vehicle for consumer culture through advertising. Early Ford automobiles. Imagine with the automobile, I mean, obviously if you're in the steel industry, you're going to make a fortune. If you're in the oil business, you're going to make a fortune. If you have anything to do with the rubber business or glass or so on. So some of the old industries will thrive anew, but also the automobile brings new industries into being. You know, motels for people to stay at because Americans can vacation, you know, far and wide and not just, you know, spend a day in another part of the city or whatever. Go visit the mountains, or as you say, the beach. Gas stations, service stations come into being, of course, and so on. Look at that ad at bottom right. I love this because, you know, I could pull up YouTube and some advertiser has, 5 seconds to convince me I need to continue watching this ad before I click skip. Imagine a day and time where it was assumed, and I think rightly, that people would actually sit and read a short essay on why they need a Ford automobile. Advertising has certainly changed. That being said, one of the other things you could listen to on that radio is what was becoming at that time America's pastime, baseball. And with the ability for people all over the country to hear a Boston Red Sox game or a New York Yankees game, they can learn about the exploits of Babe Ruth by something other than just reading a box score or a story in a print newspaper.
Was color really a nickel back then?
Was it really what?
A nickel?
Yeah, and then you have to factor in inflation, and over time the devaluing of currency and the inflation of prices is just a natural occurrence with the growth of economies. So if we were to adjust that 5 cents for inflation, and now you can do this online apparently.
As a converter?
Mm-hmm.
As a converter?
Yes. There'd be a converter where one of us could go online right now and convert that. It's probably more in the neighborhood of what you would expect to pay for a Coke now, which would be like $1.50. Maybe not. I don't think 5 cents is quite going to come out to $1.50. Bear in mind too, this is the needless to say, Red Rock lost the Cola Wars. Atlanta's own Coca-Cola and Pepsi were the big winners, right? But hey, Babe Ruth said that was the finest cola drink he ever tasted. So you have celebrity endorsements for the first time, or hell, the emergence of sports celebrities for the first time, period, in something other than, say, boxing. What do you got?
Let's see. It says here from 1983 to 1912, it's like $79. I don't know if this is the correct thing, but
Yeah, we would want to say what 5 cents is in 1920. What does that equate to in 2021?
it still says $75. Or wait a minute.
That can't be right.
Yeah.
So you'd want to enter 0.05, I think, and maybe it was treating that 5 as a $5 as opposed to 5 cents. While you're looking, though, bear in mind that, hey, 20,679, I love that completely, seemingly, probably plucked from nowhere number. Physicians say Luckies are less irritating, and bear in mind, Lucky Strikes are the ones without filters. And if that doesn't convince you, hey, it's toasted. What does that mean? Who's to say? But it seems intriguing. Your throat protection against irritation and cough. Imagine a day and time where companies could actually claim that their cigarettes were not only less irritating, but actually going to protect your throat. We have regulated the advertising industry in this regard. But anyway, I like these two because these are examples of things that very early on would have been mass-produced using assembly line production.
Well, I didn't get an exact number, but $1 is worth $1,339 now.
Okay, so you could take that and sort of consider the equivalent of that if you were to go from 5 cents as opposed to from $1. And it actually comes out where that's probably the equivalent of like $1.50, right? So it's maybe not so shocking as it seems. You're like, damn, I could get a Coke for 5 cents.
My brother went to Jamaica, and the inflation there is like so like $1 US is like $100 or $100.
Yeah.
So he sent a picture once that was this package of ramen that said $40 on it. Granted.
That's some real good ramen noodles right there. $40 ramen, very nice. Yeah, that's inflation for you. So, I mentioned at the onset that this was a decade in which marginalized people forced themselves into the sort of center of the page. I won't do the mixed metaphor this time. That is, people who were considered outside of the mainstream of society pushing their way in this case, women and African Americans. In the case of African Americans, a lot of them came around to the teaching and thinking of, it's incredible that you just mentioned Jamaica. Marcus Garvey happens to be Jamaican. Moves to New York City, to Harlem, as the head of an organization that he calls the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, an organization that advocated for what they call Pan-Africanism, the idea that black people around the world ought to work for their own collective betterment, whether they are in Africa or in the Caribbean or in America. An advocate of black nationalism, the idea that black people in America constitute a nation within a nation. And of the concept of the new Negro, that is, the Negro being the acceptable word for black people in America back then. But the idea of a new Negro being that you should reject this idea that you ought to adopt or adapt to white American culture, and that you ought to sort of play the role that white America wants you to play, an idea associated with previous black leaders, most especially Booker T. Washington, and that you should instead embrace your African heritage and focus on forging a culture and on building institutions of your own. Reject the adoption of white culture, embrace African heritage, build a uniquely African American culture, build African American institutions. The perhaps most poignant example of people doing exactly that is the creation of jazz music, which becomes such a rage that this entire decade becomes known as the Jazz Age. And as I said before, this African American cultural creation, you could make a very strong case for being America's greatest cultural contribution to the world. Jazz is born, I think a lot of people would reject what I'm about to say, so put an asterisk beside it, but born on the streets of New Orleans, Louisiana, and then the bayou and the mouth of the Mississippi River, that very cosmopolitan city where you have cultural elements that are West African, that are French, that are Spanish, that are Native American, that are Anglo-American, and where black musicians begin to, using European instruments like the trombone and the cornet and the trumpet, put together with those European instruments musical forms that sort of bend and break the strict rules of European music and adopt African polyrhythms in the process, adopt the element of what we would call swing, and using various West African beats, most especially a beat that comes to America via the Caribbean, the so-called tresillo beat, which you could just turn on to any pop station on the radio right now and you will hear it. In everything from Daddy Yankee to Justin Bieber to Ed Sheeran to Shakira. But did you also listen to European opera of the 19th century? And Georges Bizet's Carmen would adopt this beat. Jazz was born initially of players like that, like Louis Armstrong, you see pictured there, marching in parades that were sponsored by local mutual aid societies for black people in the city of New Orleans. Parades of celebration, parades for funerals, parades of commemoration, where the community would fall in behind the brass band and dance and celebrate in what they call the second line. Jazz comes out of these second line parades. And eventually takes form of the equivalent of what we would consider today a band that wouldn't just perform in these parades, but could perform in clubs, and eventually very big bands, performing in clubs everywhere from New York to Chicago to San Francisco. Remember, this too is the period of, or I say remember, perhaps in this class we haven't talked about it, I just transported myself into my African American Studies class. This is also the period of Great Migration, whereby hundreds of thousands of black people leave the South for cities in the Northeast, like New York and Philadelphia and Baltimore, and cities in the Midwest like Cincinnati and Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit, and to a lesser extent, cities out west. And seeking perhaps to escape Jim Crow and disenfranchisement, they were met with the unwelcome reality that discrimination, violence, segregation even, disenfranchisement even are American problems and not just Southern ones. But they are able to spread elements of the culture that they had created, and that would include jazz music. And so jazz takes roots in the clubs from Harlem to California. At the same time, women have been newly empowered by the enactment and ratification of the 19th Amendment guaranteeing them the right to vote. Of course, this does not translate into instantaneous political or economic equality for women, something that they would continue to have to fight for, even now. But it does perhaps inspire a sort of, not sort of, a definite departure from what we would call Victorian cultural norms. And the adoption of the idea of a new woman who didn't necessarily have to feel like she was supposed to, not go to school, but instead get married, find a husband, get pregnant, have kids, become a homemaker. And as a proxy of that, adopt all these social mores that would indicate she was a respectable lady. And I feel like I have to do this because otherwise we don't see what we just saw as particularly scandalous to us with our own cultural norms. But this would be like a late 1800s Victorian woman look. Right? Covered from neckline to ankles. Very formal. And not at all revealing by design. Now, what do you see different here? Anything at all?
Shorter hems, that's for sure.
Yes, I mean, some of those dresses are cut halfway up the thigh, for God's sake. I mean, we're talking about coming out of an age where if you're showing ankle, you're pushing the limits. So those are very high cut there. What else?
I was going to ask about the flappers, the dances.
Yeah, so these women would be flappers, right? These would be women exemplary of flapper culture who would go to clubs, dance to jazz music, all the latest dance steps, like that woman at the bottom right. And by the way, coming out of the Victorian age, a lady was not supposed to be out in public if she wasn't on the arm of some man escorting her. And we're talking about, ladies doing what any of us would do, now on a Friday night, just getting together with a group of friends and going out to the club. Mingling with men. Having a drink, which by the way was also what? Illegal during the era of Prohibition, to go into these speakeasies perhaps. And dancing to Negro music, by the way, in a period of profound racism. And mingling with other single men and whatnot. But back to specifically their look, what else do you see?
It's kind of like the high school dress code. If you show shoulder, they
Right.
too much.
Do they still do that?
Yes.
Yes.
Wow. I was thinking that was like
Or
a
the
relic
red
from my
skinny
past.
jeans. Oh.
I was gonna say they would in my day it was like how high were your shorts?
So I went to a homeschool co-op, so we were about the only thing that would have been more conservative would have been a convent, but
I gotcha.
At prom, I know they said if it's not below the knee, we're gonna hand you a pair of leggings.
Wow. I'm surprised that's still a thing, but yeah, you can see if you've got the ruler test, actually all three of them are probably going to fail that test. And like you said, shoulders are bare too, low neckline with cleavage.
With short hair.
The hair, probably more than anything, is what you see and you go, oh, that's 1920s look. That's the flapper look. The short, boyish hair, which would have been completely unacceptable and unthinkable in the Victorian age.
So on that, there's a story from my mom's side of the family. My great-grandmother's sister, her name was Jane, and so she's a big family of farm girls with all their, and you see the family picture. It's all these classic farm dresses with their black heels and everything.
Oh yeah.
But I remember the story is that she, of all of the girls in that family, was the only one who cut her hair, and it was right in this era.
There you go.
And the thing is, the fact that made it to our
It's still a story,
generation,
yeah.
it was a big thing then.
Exactly, right. And so this would have been just appalling to anyone of Victorian sensibilities, the fact that any of these ladies would wear their hair like that. And another thing that you maybe can't see, you can kind of see that these are, you speaking of colors, these are really vibrant colors too. If we're talking about Victorian era and you're going out in public and you've got on lipstick and rouge, it would have generally been assumed that you were a lady of the night of the red light district. You know what I mean? It would have been considered you're probably a prostitute. But it was becoming commonplace for ladies to wear beauty products, which, remember, those are among the new items of consumer culture, right? You guys aren't like talking shit about me, are you?
No.
What?
You keep looking over here and laughing. I'm like, I'm going to look at Arlette's pet thing and say, that is such a...
No.
He's rambling on and on.
No.
You're good. I'm picking, sort of, but I do worry sometimes. Yeah, all of these things, pushing the boundaries, indicative of this flapper culture and the embrace of a new woman who, and think this is not 100% entirely new. Think about Jane Addams in the Progressive era. Indicative of somebody who decided, I'm going to get an education and I'm going to stay single so I can pursue my career as a social activist and so on. So there was something to build upon here. Similar to the idea of the new Negro, that is, women who refuse to fit the mold. Women who embraced flapper culture.
So this would be pretty much them just creating a different culture that wasn't based off of like the natural.
Exactly. Not based upon the idea that their whole life should be geared towards becoming a homemaker or a housewife, right? So similar to Garvey saying we don't need to adopt or adapt to white culture, these women are saying we don't need to, accept at face value this idea that our whole life is to become a housewife, right? And we don't have to accept being told that we have to be covered head to toe and not go out in public unless we're escorted by a man and so on, right?
And I think on the other thing I mentioned about my aunt, my person on my mom's side, I think of all of them, she was the only one who was never married.
There you go. Yeah. So, perfect example. That being said, by the end of the decade, it all begins, and I stress that word begins, to come crashing down. Why do I stress the word begins? Because I do not want you to tell me on a quiz or an exam that the American economy was great and we were in the roaring 20s and the jazz age, and then in 1929 the stock market crashed and we all of a sudden had a Great Depression. It's not that simple. For some reason, we place this great emphasis on the stock market crash and forget everything else that was in play. Yes, the stock market crash has something to do with it, but it in itself has causes that are part of a deeper problem. And we are not really at the depths of the Great Depression until 1932, so there's a lot happening between 1929 and 1932, and of course the Depression lasts for many years after that. Having said that at the onset, if we're talking about causes or the roots of the Great Depression, I should tell you this is debatable, and it's a politicized debate, and if you were to go around and ask a bunch of different economists or historians or political scientists, you might get some slightly different answers as to what quote-unquote caused the Great Depression. I am more or less presenting it as your textbook does, which is to focus on structural flaws in the American economy. Structural flaws, imagine that as a metaphor for like the foundation of a house. A foundation in which the bones are not so good, in which there is perhaps something rotten in that foundation, where if you looked at the home from the outside, it might look fine, but underneath something is not right. And that's ultimately going to bring that house down. So what are these structural flaws? One I mentioned earlier, in the 1920s, corporate profits were increasing, but the wages for their workers were not going up along with those profits. Corporate profits were not trickling down in this age of laissez-faire as they were supposed to, and translating to higher wages for workers. What you have to bear in mind is that the American worker is also the American consumer. And if prices of things are going up and their wages are not, that is the gradual erosion of their ability to consume. And if consumers can't consume the products companies make, they ain't going to make those profits anymore. So corporate earnings or profits increasing, wages stagnant, wages not increasing. What else? In the agricultural sector, so that's sort of in manufacturing, but in the agricultural sector, by the end of the decade, there is there are chronic low prices in the commodities sector. So for things like cotton or wheat or oranges, and if farmers are not getting a good price for the produce that they're growing and harvesting and selling, they might eventually have to mortgage that farm that's been in the family for generations. And then who technically owns the land? The bank. And if you continue to have, a low price issue, or the economy tanks and it collapses even farther, especially if you keep producing at the same rate, as we'll see, you might lose that farm altogether. And so what you have is, because of these low commodity prices, farmers becoming beholden to the banks, the rise of debt. And that's not just common to farmers too. People were buying on credit more and more. We're not quite to the point of credit cards yet, but some of those nice consumer products like automobiles or radios might have been bought on credit. And then also, in terms of structural flaws, perhaps most poignantly, there is a misguided optimism, or the belief that the American economy had just entered a period of nonstop growth. We measure the health of our economy by looking at certain, what we might call macroeconomic indicators, typically every 3 months or so. That is every quarter, 4 times a year, right? Have you guys had micro or macro econ, most of you?
Oh, I hate it. The ceiling and the floor. And
Oh yeah, and supply and demand.
yeah, whatever.
So if we're talking about macroeconomic indicators, among those would be to look at like the gross domestic product, the GDP, the measure of what Americans are producing. And typically in a capitalist economy, every quarter you ought to be able to look at that and it ought to be going up, right? Growth. Sometimes in a quarter that number will go down and say, oh, that's negative growth, or that's shrinkage, and that shouldn't happen, but occasionally it does. And then sometimes it might be another quarter and another quarter where the numbers are in the negative, and then you've entered a recession. Looking back, and this is, depression is actually not a fundamental concept or word in actual economics. It's one we've kind of invented to describe a recession that's really, really bad or really, really long. And looking back to the Gilded Age, in the 1870s and 1890s, there were 2 pretty significant depressions. But since that time, since the 1890s, the American economy to this point had done nothing but grow. And people thought that that was just a permanent thing. That the depressions of the Gilded Age were like fits of industrial adolescence. And that the economy is just going to grow and grow and grow forevermore. And if you apply that thinking specifically to the stock market, man, I don't have my notes, so I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the value of stocks from even from the 19 teens and through the 1920s, I mean, it like quadrupled. And so if you put those together, there's this thinking that the stock market especially was easy, guaranteed money and big money. And that's going to lead to some reckless investing. That's a key component here, reckless investing, which could take on different forms, multiple different forms, in fact, but one of which a lot of very wealthy individuals just put everything they had into the stock market. That's one of the ways in which we can see this, what becomes this Great Depression, doesn't just ruin a lot of working class people or farmers. It ruins a lot of rich people too, because they put every dime they had in the stock market, and when it collapses, it's all gone.
GameStop.
Yeah, you guys are all too familiar with the swings of the market, if you will, thanks to that whole fiasco, right? But consider too, there was something back then called buying stocks on margin, which is, let's say you wanted to buy $1,000 in Ford Motor Company stock or U.S. Steel or whatever, and you didn't have $1,000, but you go to a broker and you pay them like $200 down, like a down payment. And then you would continue to make payments on the rest of the remaining $800, which, if we're looking at a period of nonstop growth and quadrupling of stock market values, that's no big deal, because by the time you've paid off the remaining $800, your $1,000 is worth $2,000, right? Except when it's not. Except when the market collapses and your $1,000 is now worth $500, but you still owe $800. You see? That's reckless investing, buying on margin. And so those would be among the causes specifically then of the market crash that occurs in the fall of 1929. on so-called Black Tuesday, when there's a panic, it becomes what you might call an economic self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning people fear there's going to be a crash in the market, and if you have got all your money tied up in stocks and you're worried over the weekend that when stocks trading opens up the next week, all the stocks are going to drop in value, you're going to want to do what? Go sell all your stock and get out before it happens. Well, now, when everybody does that, though, that's what causes the crash they thought was going to happen. You see that how it's a self-fulfilling prophecy? You feared X was going to happen. You did Y, and Y causes X to happen. That make sense? That's what happens on Black Tuesday in 1929, but I want you to look at that graph. It's a graph of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. This is an average of very significant, valuable corporate stocks that we still use today to measure the health of the stock market, generally. And I want you to look at this because, one, you can see the significant growth of stock values, the almost exponential growth during the teens and 20s. This is Black Tuesday, folks. That's a significant drop, but look at this. It gets way worse between 1929 and 1932. Way worse. And so that's what I mean when I say it's not like you snap your fingers on Black Tuesday and we go from roaring 20s to Great Depression. There's a lot happening in those 3 years, a downward spiral of sorts. There's so much that I used to have to go out of my way to explain that due to the events of the last year, it's easier to explain. For example, when you enter into unprecedented hard economic times, you might not buy a bunch of shit that you would have bought when times were better. And you might instead save what money you could. You might not be so keen to listen when these companies are telling you you need fill-in-the-blank product to make your life better. You might consider that you only actually need the bare necessities. So you stop purchasing things. And again, if we consider that we're about to have a rash of unemployment and wages going down and salaries going down, that's fewer and fewer people who have the ability to purchase anything at all. And so that's going to hurt corporations who see their profits decrease because people aren't buying their products. And then, of course, what do companies have to do when their profits or revenues go down because people aren't buying their products? Stop production, fire people, lay people off, cut their wages, cut their hours, cut their salaries, and that's less money for consumers to consume, which only makes it worse. But no single corporate board is sitting there going, oh, if we do this, it's going to be part of a larger problem. They're looking at their own numbers and their own red ink, so to speak. And at the same time, you apply that panic thinking that we talked about with the stock market crash and the self-fulfilling prophecy to banks as well. There's no regulation really of banking back then that would protect your money in a bank. And so if you have your money in some bank that you worry is, making bad investments and that maybe is going to go under, you might want to run down to the bank, maybe even literally, and get your damn money out before that happens. But of course, when everybody goes and runs down to the bank to get their money out, that causes the bank to fail. Another example of you fear X happening, you do Y, and Y causes X to happen. This happens to thousands of banks all throughout the country as people go get their money out and go stuff it under a mattress or bury it in the backyard or something. Herbert Hoover is the president, as I mentioned before, and is forced to deal with this. And it's, I think, sometimes wrongly perceived that Hoover didn't do anything to stop this. That's not true. It's that the things that he did do not only don't help, but if you consider along with what he does, the actions of Congress, they might even make things worse. Hoover was not a 100% laissez-faire guy. I mean, You might call him a progressive Republican. He'd actually served in the Wilson administration. You remember the Food Administration and the propaganda during the war? That was Hoover. So he has some experience in government regulatory services. So there were some efforts made, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't nearly enough. The programs that the Hoover administration rolls out to deal with this problem are a fraction of what it would have taken to meet the challenge. While at the same time, Congress fumbles attempts to, for example, protect American farmers by enacting massive protectionary tariffs on other countries' produce so people would buy American, which only leads those countries to retaliate against America and slap big-ass tariffs on American exports, which hurt American companies. And which, of course, increase prices across the board. So, what are the effects by 1932? When we assess this, I want you to keep in mind there's no government safety net in place. The numbers I'm going to throw at you are going to be similar to what we saw the past year. The difference is we live in a day and age in which we do have a government safety net. We do embrace the idea of government deficit spending in a time of recession to stimulate the economy. We do have Social Security and unemployment insurance, right? We do have the FDIC and the SEC and other government regulatory agencies. They didn't have any of that back then. So there's nothing to keep this from getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And when you look at the numbers, factories all over the country are closed to the point where in some industries they're at like 25% production, meaning their factories are producing a quarter of what they had been in 1929 by 1932. Unemployment due to layoffs throughout the country is 25%, a number that used to be shocking until we met that number last year. But again, consider back then there was no Social Security unemployment insurance. And there were no stimulus payments going out, certainly not on the order of what we have seen in the last year. The GDP collapses by a third. Again, something that's shocking had we not experienced similar last year. Now, one thing we did not experience is a rash of thousands of bank failures, something like 5,000 failed banks throughout the country. That's millions of dollars in savings gone with the wind. Along with the absolute collapse of the stock market and the wiping out of fortunes that you saw reflected by that graph of the Dow Jones collapse. So people are hungry. They're homeless. They're jobless. They're displaced. A lot of the farmers in the Midwest, particularly in an area that becomes known as the Dust Bowl, lose everything. They have to pile up what meager possessions they had onto the family truck and drive out west to California in the hopes of getting fruit picking jobs that aren't really there. Living in migrant camps along the side of the road, subject to the harassment of local people who didn't want them there. This is not just a phenomenon for farmers. I mean, you can look at cities where people are unemployed and evicted from their houses or apartments and end up living in shanty towns that become known as Hoovervilles. People sleeping on park benches underneath a newspaper that become known as Hoover blankets. People deliberately wearing their pockets inside out like this to call it a Hoover flag to signify they have no money. Let me see. We're not here yet in terms of the outline. I just want to say, people in a little bit of dark humor living in one of these Hoovervilles and having their poor dirty little kids sit out there with the Hoover's Poor Farm Tobacco Fund. Hard times are hoovering over us. Point being, anytime you are the American president and the economy is going well, whether that's a result of your policies or not, you get credit for it. And anytime the economy is doing poorly, whether or not that is a result of your policies, you get blamed for it. So regardless of your opinion of the actions of Herbert Hoover, he's going to take the butt of the blame for this depression. There's some images of migrant farmers moving out west to California where the locals want you to know there are no jobs. Keep out. But there are these rumors that gave people hope. And so hundreds of thousands of people driving out there for a handful of jobs. Particularly those affected by this Dust Bowl phenomenon. Already you know that prices for commodities like wheat that was produced in the southern Great Plains, Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, were catastrophically low, and then you add to that that there was in the late 20s a prolonged drought. It did not rain in that area. And add to that the exhaustion of the soil, people not realizing that continually planting that wheat crop year after year in the same land would eventually, over time, deplete that soil of its nutrients. And then you have these windstorms that then become huge dust storms that whip up the topsoil and not only blow it away, but blow it through your home and through your town and into your lungs, and people get sick and die. It's a pretty terrifying phenomenon regardless. But the net result, when it blows all the topsoil away, ain't nobody growing anything, regardless of the price in the market. And so a lot of farmers are ruined and have nothing left to do but pile under that car and move out west. Where again, they end up in California derided as dirty Okies, even though not all of them are from Oklahoma, and are subject to harassment and violence even. Well, as I said, we're asking ourselves who's responsible, who gets the blame. It's the president who has to stand for re-election in 1932. And you had a series of Republican presidents in office going back to Warren Harding. And so there was some hope, even as bad as it was, that Hoover could win re-election. Running against the young Democrat from the wealthy New York family, the Roosevelts, is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, often known as FDR, who is going to beat him soundly in this election, and not just a landslide victory for him as president, but a complete shift in the control of the American government, because the Democratic Party won control in that election of the House of Representatives and of the Senate. When you have that kind of shift of the White House and both houses of Congress from one party to another, you can say that the American people have given that party a mandate for change. That is, given them the the approval to make big changes, to do something, anything in this case, to turn this depression around. And that's what Roosevelt had promised to do. He's offering the American people a New Deal. Well, what would that mean? It wasn't totally clear. In fact, as we're going to see, not even Roosevelt fully understood what that would mean. What it meant in a general sense is they're going to try a lot of different things. Some of those things are not going to work. Some of them will. We'll parse through that in the next lecture. But a couple of other things, though, before I let you go. If you look at that electoral map, you will not see that very often. If you go back to American presidential election, rarely is it that one-sided. Now, the popular vote wasn't quite so one-sided as this map would indicate in terms of the electoral vote, with the blue states obviously being for the Democrat Roosevelt. But still, again, consider that the Democrats won control of both houses of Congress in the same election, and that equates to, again, a mandate for change. They do this by putting together, and I say putting together, it's not as simple as that sounds, making an appeal that was heard by, that was taken up by a broad coalition of the American people. That would include sometimes people that on the surface didn't have a whole lot in common. We're talking about the Democratic Party still at that time in the South being the party of white supremacy and of purportedly Protestant Christian people in the same party that's appealing to Catholic immigrants in New York City. And at the same time is appealing to African Americans in the Midwest, West, or Northeast where they could vote. Appealing to women who've been newly empowered by the 19th Amendment. Appealing to people who are willing to accept, what might this New Deal mean in terms of restructuring the American regulatory state. So we'll see in our next lecture, what does this New Deal actually entail? We'll look at what works, what doesn't, the effect it does or doesn't have on the Depression, and so on. Are there any questions, comments, or concerns?